Okay, since we've learned about Swedish punctuality, we want to start the next session. Good afternoon for session 2. Welcome, as it says here, or if I'm not completely wrongly, välkomna, if it was Swedish, but that's about all you will hear from me in Swedish. My name is Mark Kohl. I'm professor for media and telecommunication law at the University of Luxembourg and the director for academic affairs at the Institute of European Media Law. In this session, as you can see, we want to talk about better conditions for editorial media and higher trust in editorial media. And more importantly, because we probably all agree on the goal, how can we reach that? What is the role that national policies can play in that role? What is the role that the EU can play? And basically, since we started this conference, we've already been indicating on these topics. In the opening keynotes, we heard media policy as media regulation, and the big question is, what is the right way forward? 35 years ago, when research on European Union media law started, there was one piece of legislation, one directive. And we have quite impressively heard in the last session how much that has multiplied in the last couple of years. And there's more to come. So in this session, we first explore where do we stand? What are the challenges why we need regulation in order to enhance the role of editorial media or editorially responsible created content? We heard about the platform regulation in the previous session, and now it's really about the media, traditional media, to use a maybe more a more nice-sounding word, in the role that media can play in future in the democratic discourse. And the big important question, as I indicated, is not only what do we regulate, but who regulates. It's a very interesting conference at the beginning of this presidency of Sweden to clarify what is the best place to make sure that we have a future role of the media to play in the democratic discourse, both on member state level and on the level of the European Union. So that's what we would try and clarify both with the keynote speakers and, sorry for that, and with the panelists after. We have heard the expression EMFA or MFA or Media Freedom Act. I even heard the expression media law. And if you listen very carefully, Commissioner Breton in his video speech said, and now there is one missing puzzle, the EMFA. I hope he actually meant a missing puzzle piece, because if it's a whole missing puzzle, the EMFA, then the whole situation will get even more complex. But this missing puzzle piece is the one that we really want to discuss and focus on now. But before we discuss what EMFA can answer and what the future media policies have to look like, we need to know why is it so relevant to have media regulation. And in order to do so, we've got two very distinguished keynote speakers who will give you a setting the scene. We will first have Tobias Lindberg. He is from Nordicom, which is a research center for Nordic media research of the University of Gothenburg. And we already heard before, the Nordics is like a region within the European Union beyond individual member state level, but with a very similar, maybe cultural approach. So first, Tobias will explain to us a little bit how the media landscape has changed here in the Nordic, before Carl Miller will then give us a more or less economic, more policy-oriented perspective. Carl Miller is research director at Demos, which is the Center for the Analysis of, or which has a research track, which is the Center for the Analysis of Social Media. Carl, when I looked up what you're doing, I was thinking 10 years ago he couldn't even have that job because social media was only just coming into being, right? Nowadays, we need indeed in-depth research on the role of social media and how big tech or the giant tech or the tech giants, whatever you want to call them, have influenced political and democratic discourse. So first, Tobias, you with your first 15 minutes of insight, and then after that, Carl, come on stage, please.
So, thank you very much. Well, as we heard, Mark said, there's happened a lot of things in the last years. And during the last 5 to 10 years, the Nordic media business have experienced some dramatic changes, probably the most dramatic changes they've experienced since the late 1800s. Then it was the industrialization and the growing literacy that drove this transformation. Today, it is, of course, the digitalization and the easy access to technology. And it is this transformation I'm going to talk about in my presentation, when I will do so based on a fairly new report called Nordic News Media in Global Competition. I have to read what it's actually called. I've written it, but I haven't read it. And this report focus on the conditions for news journalism. So I'm going to talk about news media, not media in general. And I'm going to talk about that, what happened between 2016 and 2021. And let's change picture here. And I'm going to do so in 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk a little about what characterized the Nordic media markets, and that in a comparison with the European Union. And in part 2, I will outline 10 trends that I mean characterize this transformation. And I will conclude by talking a little bit about the effects of this transformation, both for the Nordic media policies and the ones in EU as a whole. But before we dive into this chart and others, I just want to mention that the report is financed by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and that the translation into English, which we published just last week, is co-funded by the European Union. So let's start with one simple fact. The Nordic media markets are very digital if we compare to other markets. And maybe you wonder why, and maybe the most important reason is money. There is enough, as you can see from this chart over GDPs, there's enough money in the Nordic markets so that we as news consumers can buy the devices we need, smartphones, computers, etc. There's just a more affluent markets than many other markets in the European Union. We're also very eager to use internet here in the Nordics. Almost 10 out of 10 people in the Nordic region uses internet daily or almost daily. We're also more eager to consume our news online. If you can see in this chart, last year, have to see here, between 84 and 96% of the population in these countries read news online. If you look at the EU 27, it's 71%. And we also tend to trust our news media in a higher extent than many other parts of EU. So a lot of that's the characteristics of it. So, but what has happened during these years? Well, being this digital means that we are also more exposed to the effects of this digital transformation, both the positive one and the negative ones. And one effect is that we have, since 2016, increased our digital media consumption dramatically. And at the same time, we cut back on our uses of printed newspapers. When our consumption went down, the revenues to the news media companies also went down. Not brain surgery, that's what's happened. But at the same time, as the advertising money from the printed newspapers went out the window, the Nordic news media companies launched a new source of revenues, digital subscriptions. That source of revenue wasn't only launched here, of course, but I would say that the Nordic media companies have been more successful in this corner of the market than, if not all, anyway, most of the media markets in the world. According to a current study from Reuters Institute at Oxford University, over 40% of the Norwegian population paid for news online last year. For Sweden, the same share was 33%, and in Denmark and Denmark and Finland, it was 18-19%. So even if the Nordic region as a whole has been very successful, there are differences between the markets. One of the reasons for these differences, I would say, is tradition. Norway have a very strong tradition of paying for news. That tradition isn't that strong in Denmark, for example. In Denmark, for decades, they had a very strong tradition for free news weeklies, and it played an important role in distributing news in the local community. So differences in tradition is one of the reasons why we see these differences. And at the same time, as we as news consumer have changed our media habits, the advertisers have changed theirs. Since 2016, they have continued to move away from legacy media in their traditional forms and invest in even more money in the digital channels like the platforms. Channels, non-journalistic platforms. They're moved away from publishing that deals with journalism. And another interesting factor here is that scale has proven to be a decisive factor for success during these years. So in the digital world, size matter. Oops, the share too. Well, but this logic that the size matter is of course not only applicable when we're talking about the larger Nordic news media companies in relation to the smaller ones. It's also, or if not even more relatable when we're talking about the big platforms, like Meta, like Alphabet and so on, Microsoft. And they have gained a lot of new advertising money during these years. If we, an estimated 72% of the digital ad investments in Sweden in 2021 went to the non-Nordic media entities, like the platforms. In Finland and Denmark, the same proportion was 64%, and in Norway, roughly 59%, probably higher. I don't have the actual the current figure for Iceland, but it's well above 40% anyway. And this digital logic had some consequences if we look at the infrastructure of the media business. So if a Nordic news media company wants to offer its ad services to the entire market, today they have to work with Google in some shape, way, or form or another, because Google owns the biggest ad exchange in the world. It's like a stock exchange, but you don't sell and buy stocks, you buy and sell digital advertising space. And much of the same things can be said about the consumer market, because the platforms, in this case, Google and Apple, owns the biggest, or almost the only markets, App Store and Google Play. So if a Nordic news media company wants to offer its services, they have to collaborate and adapt to these rules, of course. So when we as news consumers increase our digital media consumption, and when the advertisers increase their investments in these channels, the positions of these platforms is going to be strengthened, and that is just what's happened during these years. So I would say that the platforms had a firmer grip of the Nordic news media market in 2021 than they had in 2016. But these positions might be about to be challenged. We heard about it earlier from Professor Rosati about the new laws that have been implemented during last year, so I won't dwell on that. But these laws, at least in theory, they have strengthened the positions of the Nordic news media companies and the European ones. So we might be about to see some changes. Another reason for that the position might be challenged is a financial turnaround. Many of the Nordic news media companies stand on a firmer financial footing today than they did 5 years ago. And there's at least two reasons for that. One is the one I mentioned, digital subscription. The revenues from that has benefited the Nordic news media companies. Actually, all major Nordic news media companies showed profit in 2021. I haven't seen all the figures yet for 2022, but it looks fairly good. Another reason is this consolidation I mentioned earlier. One consequence of that is cost savings. So once again, size matter in the digital world. So they're better positioned, the Nordic news media companies today, than they were before the pandemic. The last point I have about what happened during these years is there's been a more tougher competition for skills. The digitalization of society has meant that the media businesses do not only compete with each other when it's about talent anymore. They compete with the big financial sector, they compete with retail, they compete with the big industrial companies. Because the skills, like highly advanced IT skills, highly advanced editorial skills, these skills are widely sought after today. So there are many more people trying to compete about the employees of the media market. So, but what does all of this mean? All that this has happened during these years. What does it mean? Well, I would argue that we're going to continue to see an even more consolidated media markets because the digital logic, which favors large scale. And this would put an extra pressure on smaller markets, and smaller language areas. And would make it even harder for, of course, for smaller media companies. Challenge number 2, increasingly important role of audience revenues as source of revenue. I must admit I have no idea what that means, but what I want to say is that audience-funded journalism is set to continue. It seems the most promising way forward. Advertising money is not the major source of revenue for most media companies today. It is the revenues from the audiences. And that will create a lot of problems because it's a good thing, but it's going to make it hard to finance high-quality journalists in a smaller market with the money from the audience only. The problem is going to need some sort of subsidy, if you look at the smaller market, to continue with their high-quality journalism. And most of the subsidy schemes that we have in Europe today were drawn up when the advertising revenues was the most important one. It isn't anymore. So that's something to think about. Challenge number 3 then, greater proportion of material for paying customers only. Well, it's a continuum of the second one, of course, because when audience revenue is the most important one, it's most likely that a greater proportion of the journalism produced will be put behind some sort of paywall. And that might lead to that a greater proportion of the public are excluded from high-quality journalism, and that might increase the risk of misinformation and disinformation. Challenge number 4 then, shrinking hard copy sales. Well, when a printed newspaper ceases to be or reduces frequency, the costs for distribution are, well, they're shared among those who remain in the system, so their costs will increase. And this might lead to that we will see that the printed newspaper is phased out earlier than the public prefer. And we know from history that if a medium ceases to be, not all of its users take that, in our case today, that digital leap. Some won't, and we might lose them on the road in this transition. Time flies, so I will put challenge 5 and 6 together. Increasing digitization and increased amount of data. Well, as we heard about earlier today, the digital evolution will of course continue. Artificial intelligence, VR, and metaverse and whatnot. This will of course increase the data produced about us. And this data will be even harder than today to regulate via national legislation. There's also, I think it was Kate who mentioned it earlier, that with artificial intelligence is going to raise a lot of questions if we're talking about freedom of expression and press freedom. That's a lot to think about what will happen with that. And so I would say that first-hand data, first-party data, will become even more valuable in the years to come. and we have to think about how we regulate that. My last challenge then is the growing need for advanced IT skills. Also no-brainer, because this digital evolution will continue, but maybe this is a kind of criticism to myself, or a challenge, since I work at a university. We have to think how we educate our future journalists and those who study media and communication, because they're going to need a lot more knowledge about the digital world, about data. They don't need to code. No, not code. They have to understand what this new digital landscape means, how they can use it, and how it can be used against them. So, that was actually my 15 minutes, maybe not of fame, but on the stage, anyway, for this time. So, thank you very much. And if you want to read the report, you can always download it from Nordicom's website. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you very much. And actually, I was going to advertise it because the report is very worth read. It was impossible for me to look at it in Swedish, but since it's there since last week in English, it's definitely worth looking into it. And I'm happy that you also had some optimistic words. So usually when you hear about the economic situation of the media markets, it's very often very pessimistic, but we had some ideas which I think we can pick up in the discussion. Carl, we would now like to hear from you about the impact tech giants have on the social discourse, on democratic functioning of our markets and societies.
All right, well, I have actually had this job for 11 years, David. The difference is that for most of that time, no one actually thought it was a real job. So sometimes you'd be kind of introduced as like a kind of digital guru or something up on stage. But right, I've been asked to talk about the power of the tech giants. And this is really a kind of story, I guess, which is all about layers. This is all about the kind of interlocking, interacting, kind of overlapping series of different kind of powers, which have kind of all built up with each other. So in these 15 minutes, what I'm going to do is try and excavate these layers for us all by taking you on a bit of a kind of journey or a tour of the kind of psychogeography of Silicon Valley. So we're on the plane, and probably the first thing that we realize when we're kind of flying into Silicon Valley, the valley, for the first time, is that it's not really much of a valley really at all. It's actually quite a kind of shallow, bottomed basin. And with kind of cut through the middle of it is an absolutely beautiful, glittering inlet of water, the bay. And it's surrounded by the hills. These are kind of variously mountainous kind of terrain, which are actually really important because it kind of prevents in the valley what you say you see in Los Angeles or basically anywhere else in the States, which is kind of endless sprawl. No, you're either in the valley or you're out of it, and there's a quite clear boundary between the two. So we've landed in the valley and we've landed in San Francisco. And you step on this kind of lurching, two-story, screeching silver train, the cow train, and you start going down the tracks which kind of hug the south side of the bay. And as you go down there, you go past all the different places which are absolutely synonymous with technology. Back at the top, you can see Salesforce, you can see Twitter, you can see Uber, you can see Airbnb. You wave goodbye to them, and as you start going down, you go past Mountain View, Cupertino, and then we get to Menlo Park. And in Menlo Park, we get off, and there's a huge like fist, and we walk. A thumb, and we walk into Facebook. One hack away, Menlo Park, Facebook. And as you go in there, you realize that there are these glades, there are juice bars, there are people hanging out around the world-class wood shop. There are people on not a roof garden, but something like a roof forest. It's gigantic. It's lovely. It's like Disneyland. The only difference is that everything is way cheaper or indeed free. So completely unlike Disneyland. And there that brings us really to, I guess, the most obvious first kind of layer of power that the tech giants have. And that's obviously money. So whether it's Google or Amazon or Facebook or Apple or Intel or Nvidia or Salesforce or any of these companies, they're all kind of totemic symbols of a general thing which has happened in our economy over the last kind of 20 years or so, which is that software has eaten the world. Now, basically, anywhere you look, whether it's in recruiting or whether it's in advertising or whether it's in taxis or hotels, what has emerged is a software company, normally 1, 2, 3, oligopolies, duopolies, monopolies, who have kind of demonstrated really that the kind of commanding heights of the economy used to be the kind of means of production, and now they're the means of mediation. The kind of rise of Web 2 has kind of demonstrated that now we have companies who can generate just enormous, astonishing value, the biggest company in the world, by connecting us with the things that we want to buy. And that has accumulated, I mean, it's just worth saying, it's just actually worth reminding everyone about the astonishing amounts of money that have flowed into the valley over the last 20 or 30 years in the second wave of Web 2. Astonishing, astonishing, astonishing amounts of money have gone in there. So, we're in Hacker Square. And we're going to go into one of the biggest indoor workspaces in the world, the Geary building. And in there, you're going to see a space which is so breathtakingly large, you can't really see the end. But none of it ever repeats itself. It's really one of the most beautiful buildings you'll ever go to. There are kind of meeting alcoves, sunken areas, there are juice bars. You can vend yourself a keyboard, if you want, from one of the machines. Like outside, there are posters everywhere on the inside saying, hack, keep working, work faster. And then you can kind of see across, this kind of loose collection of different kinds of teams, of course. You've got kind of policy, you've got legal, but where we're going to settle next in this journey is going to be the growth team. Because the growth team is probably the most important of all of the different teams or kind of interests within the tech giants. And it's worth saying often that that there's normally this kind of tension that's kind of held between kind of legal and safety and policy normally on one side and growth and revenue on the other. They don't have the same incentives, and there's normally some kind of struggle over what the product should really look like. The growth team, typically over the history of the tech giants, has normally won that kind of battle. And the growth team has been locked in a kind of furious competition with the growth teams of all the other tech giants over that time. And they've been wielding from the most obvious kind of power and money to now power layer 2, I think the most hidden kind of power that the tech giants have. And that's the power of friction. Because what the growth team has been really kind of carefully doing over much of that time is to wield something which we don't talk much about outside the tech giants. It's enormously important inside. And that isn't really the power of making things either possible or impossible. It's the power of making things easier or more difficult to do. So if you can imagine the kind of sum total of billions of human beings all interacting on these platforms, it's kind of like a gushing torrent. And what friction does is that it kind of allows these teams to kind of cut grooves to allow behavior to go in one direction to kind of dam up others, simply by making some things joining, liking, responding, sharing ever more easy to do, fewer and fewer clicks, and making other things leaving ever more difficult. To give you a practical example, by the way, just to bring this back to the GDPR for a second, here's a good example of friction. I won't name the company. I was trying to exercise my digital subject access request to get my data out of one of these. To join the platform I was trying to get the data from was 3 clicks. To get my data out of that platform, to exercise my legal rights, required me to write a physical letter and mail it to Paris. That is the power of friction. So we've got we have these tech teams who have been kind of wielding kind of various kind of platform design principles in order to make some things easier and other things more difficult. But if we step outside, actually, now of the Geary building, step outside of Facebook, and we go down the road to the sleek and expensive campus of Stanford, I want to tell you about power number 3. Now there, you'll see the Persuasive Technology Lab. And it's a lab, actually, that many of the people that have led growth through many of these platforms have all gone through. And it's a laboratory that's really worked on, I think, quite an arcane and strange discipline, which is all about building platforms which can create an itch for people to have to use them. It's about the kind of promotion or habituation of the use of these platforms. And it's a bit of a grab bag as an academic discipline. You've got kind of dopamine studies, you've got kind of behavioral psychology, they're interested in why rats keep pressing the meter to get the food, they're interested in how our brains work. But that all comes together to really create some platform design principles which are absolutely visible in so many of these platforms. And so this power is the power over our habits. creating those itches. The most important, by the way, of all of this are kind of variable reward loops. It's the same as in gambling. You drag that infinite scroll down. Sometimes you get something really boring. Sometimes you get absolutely brilliant. But if you keep that variable, you keep people guessing, actually that's extremely compelling. And that really is where habits are born. That's where habits come from. And you can read Hooked. It's a book written by one of the graduates of the Persuasive Technology Lab, where it will cheerfully lay out the models and the thinking and the underlying academic theory and the underlying evidence to get these platforms to create those itches. So the power over our habits. That's power number 3. Which, by the way, I mean, I find that both the kind of power which is so close to us, so carefully shaped around who we really are, but also the one that really isn't doing what it says on the tin. Because this isn't a power over persuasion, this is really a power over compulsion. And until recently, there's basically been no real meaningful kind of ethical frameworks about how that could actually be deployed in platform design. Right, power number 4. Right, this is a somewhat awkward sieg that I have to use here to bring us back to Facebook, to a Jumbotron. So you can see a big Jumbotron with lots of messages coming up on the screen. And this is the way of basically presenting power over what is seen. We live in a hopelessly noisy world. We live in a world where our attention is by far the most important resource, the most coveted resource online, and where power isn't really about being able to speak, it's about being able to be heard. And of course, as those platforms have got bigger and bigger, of course, if they created all those itches for us, and of course, as these growth teams have had to, locked as they are in this kind of desperate battle for attention, this desperate battle for usership, they have kind of designed these platforms in order to keep us there. And the most important part of that power, the power of attention, is information curation. It's come up a couple of times. People have mentioned this, the kind of algorithms, right, that kind of feed the news, feed the timeline, you know, or the recommender algorithms you get on YouTube. This, of all the powers, if money is the most obvious, friction is the most hidden, habits is the one that's closest to us, this is the one that I think is most important. Because what has happened when you design algorithms to serve you content which maximizes, optimizes your time on the platform, has unleashed, I think rather unwittingly, a sociological process whose political and social consequences we are only beginning to actually make sense of and know what to do with. Because the kinds of content, it turns out, that you serve up to keep someone on your platform is the kind of content which sinks its hooks deepest into primordial psychologies. And sometimes that is stuff that we find really funny, and sometimes it's stuff that we find really life-affirming, but sometimes it's stuff that speaks to the darker sides that each of us carry in us. And especially, I think, for certain constituencies, it's unleashed a process. And by the way, I'm now quoting from a brilliant book called Chaos Machines, which you should read if you haven't already, by a New York Times journalist that spent a whole year looking into this. Absolutely brilliant. It unleashed a process which has gone content, speaking to people's grievances, recontextualizing those grievances as a struggle, recontextualizing that struggle as being one of in-group and out-group, and then convincing that person that they are part of a struggle over their very identity and that they need to do something about it. Just to sidebar this, the problem with disinformation isn't a problem of people using the internet to spam dodgy facts at each other. The problem with disinformation is that that process has created cults willing to listen to those facts. The problem with disinformation is one of the creation of meaning and belonging and reasons for getting up in the morning, which are entirely antithetical to the basic principles we have around science, we have around professional journalism and all those other things. QAnon is a cult, personal view. But anyway, that kind of underlying social change is such an important part of why disinformation is a problem now. It's not being addressed by us simply trying to talk about confronting facts on the fact level. Power number 5 is the most concentrated. And this is a power this is a power which concentrates in the single individuals. So when you're in these giant companies, you kind of forget also that they are quite strange companies for their size. And they quite often concentrate power up to the very founders that created them. Through the shares that they hold, they still have decision-making power, even when their kind of economic participation becomes more and more diluted, or when the company IPOs. And that means that Jack and Mark, and Elon, these tiny number of individuals can change the course of those companies as they want to. And in many ways, I think that makes that's the kind of most destabilizing and least resilient part of that whole process. We haven't really seen that exercise really before Elon Musk's entry into Twitter. And I think we're just beginning to realize what that really means now. The kind of vicissitudes of any individual. Where power is concentrated at the very top. So, 5 layers of power. I wanted to end, actually, just by some thoughts, not about how the tech giants are powerful, but about how they're actually much weaker than we suspect. And they're weak in 3 different ways. Firstly, they are vulnerable to their own employees in ways I don't think we often appreciate. So that might be activist tech talent leaving, like we've seen with some of the tech giants. But it might also actually be the unionization of workers within those companies. They are also, I think this is really true, and this came up already, decentralization, I think, is something that they're very nervous by. And that's really why they're being exhorted to hack and continue to innovate, because they can see in their peripheral mirror, not just alt tech for sure, but actually completely decentralized platforms or protocol-based platforms like Mastodon in their rearview mirror as well, coming up. But then lastly, and probably most importantly, the people that they're most vulnerable to are all of you. Because, I say this now as a Brit, I say this with jealousy, trying to keep the jealousy out of my voice. The European Union is the single most important entity for putting guardrails around all of that power in the world, for sure. And I haven't laid out those layers of power, by the way, I think, or I hope not, to take kind of cheap shots at the tech giants. I know plenty of people in there, and there's brilliant people in there doing amazing work all the time. It's just that we can't expect private companies to make some of the kind of self-limiting actions which can only come from regulation. You can't expect simply either Facebook or Google to step forward and say, I'm just going to unilaterally stop optimizing attention algorithms for my information creation. You can't. They'll get destroyed. So it has to come from the outside. I almost see it now as like a kind of question of a nuclear disarmament, where everyone's got to kind of hand their nukes in all at once until everyone only has one left, and then we can all ashore. I think that's where we are. And the European Union is the only institution in the world, in my view, that can actually make that happen. So thank you for everything that you do. For a researcher that's just been chirping on the sidelines, it's been wonderful to see all the activity coming out of the EU. There's nothing wrong with power, but what there is something wrong with is power which is unchecked and unchained and uncontrolled. And I hope, finally, we are now moving into a world where some of the power I've just described actually gets civilized, brought under control, as it always should have been all the way through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for this journey you took us on. While my fellow panelists now will come up and then I can introduce them, I guess it's my job as the moderator to get you back onto that plane, fly across the Atlantic again, more into our direction after this exciting journey, land you in the Nordic region that we heard about kindly from you, Tobias, and bring you to the heart of what is policy, and that is regulation. And we actually heard an enthusiastic plea for proper regulation. And we were thinking about how can we do this? Because we need the perspective of the ones that will be regulated or are regulated. But we also need the ones that shape this regulation. So we decided in the panel to have all possible perspectives, although I have to admit, if we wanted to have everyone that is concerned, the panel would get longer and broader. So we did a selection. We will first have Maciej Stychen, who is working at the European Commission in the DG Connect, who will actually fill up on the gaps that maybe some of you still have, namely, what is the main goal of the European Media Freedom Act? We could actually do a whole lecture on the European Media Freedom Act proposal that would take us until tomorrow afternoon. We agreed we're not going to do that. Maciej will highlight a few of those. After that, we will look at what you may call stakeholder perspectives. We will first have Richard Burnley speak, who's Director of Legal and Policy at the European Broadcasting Union. The EBU being the Association of the Public Service Media in Europe, and what their perspective is on this latest edition, although it is not yet a law, but a proposal of European media law. We will then hear Kaspar Opitz, who's the Swedish media ombudsman, and I think that is going to be a perspective that for many of you that are not from the Nordic countries is going to be very new. because it's a very, very specific and also, I think, admirable system that has been installed here in Sweden. Kaspar can talk a little bit about the inside of that system, and then again, how do you view what might happen if the European Media Freedom Act comes? And then we will move over to Petra Wikström, who is Director of Public Policy at Schibsted. I think not only the ones in the Nordic region, but also beyond, know that that is one of the main media players here. And you will also then give us your perspective on the EMFA as it is about to come. And then I will have our two keynotes answer also how you see maybe the next 5 or 10 years, how this impacts. So with that, Maciej, I know it's a very difficult task in 5 minutes, but highlight a few of the European Media Freedom Act provisions for us.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm sorry, I must admit I feel a little bit intimidated because I will have to take you back from Silicon Valley to Brussels, which is maybe not the sunniest place, but it has its effect. And I will focus on this effect and in particular on the European Media Freedom Act, which indeed is one of the landmark initiatives and I think the priority in the media policy. A proposal that was created with the very clear goal, as Mark asked me to highlight, to really ensure that European business and citizens benefit from trustworthy information that is produced in independent manner, and that media companies are empowered in this digital environment where information flows across the border and where the consumption habits change and the media market has become truly international affair. This links me to one misconception when I think sometimes when we think about media problems, that sometimes we think about specific countries when we know that there are some things that don't go well. But what we discovered from the side of the Commission and through our rule of law reports or through Media Pluralism Monitor, that actually there is no European immunity to problems of editorial independence. And for instance, last edition of Media Pluralism Monitor shows that in 22 member states, we have problems with political independence. In 21 member states, we have problems with related to owners or some sort of corporate interest that meddle with media. Only in 16 member states we have robust media self-regulation. So this idea that there are only certain regions that don't do well doesn't really fly, and there's really a need to some sort of common approach to make sure that both supply and demand side has this guarantee and has strong safeguards that protect media independence, which is I would say the key attribute of a healthy media ecosystem. And in European Media Freedom Act, the Commission takes very much this approach of proposing concrete rights and concrete safeguards, both for recipients of media services. So we have Article 3 with innovative right that ensures that every recipient of media services, of news media services in Europe, has a right to content that is produced with respect to editorial independence. We have strong rights for media services themselves, so that they are protected against any form of political independence or political interference, or in cases when the state needs to intervene, for instance, the area of journalistic sources, of journalistic communications, state can only do so if certain very strict conditions are fulfilled. We also have safeguards for a specific group of media services, public service media, which still plays a very important role for many citizens and has this mission of public service media. So through European Media Freedom Act, we want to ensure that the risks of such media becoming a political tool are minimized. So we really try to make sure that thanks to this proposal, we have a solid, and this is maybe this missing puzzle, that we have solid regulatory base that could empower and protect media services. But then the second aspect of this main objective it's the digitalization. What we are discussing, how the media industry has changed, how the consumption habits has changed. Sometimes we say that platforms are becoming the main gateways to the news consumption. In many cases, they have already become. We discovered when we were working on the proposal that for 71% of Europeans, I believe, platforms represent the main source of information. So the news consumption is on the top 3 of the most popular activities online, with online shopping and entertainment, so I think it was streaming services. So there are 3 main activities for Europeans. In some countries, I think last year in Germany, news consumption was the most popular activity online for people. That's why the idea of Media Freedom Act was also to strengthen the position of media services vis-à-vis online players. Because we also know that in many cases, the business model of online platforms, or I don't want to sound too negative, but the certain practices affect editorial integrity, and media services sometimes adapt their content in order to make sure that it stays online, that it stays within the ecosystem of very large online platforms. That's why through European Media Freedom Act, we wanted to, building on the Digital Services Act that we discussed, and I think this is a very good example how we propose something very tailor-made for media sector. When we propose the guarantees for professional media services, the ones that are regulated or produce their content in line with strict deontological standards, that such content the value of such content is recognized, and then the certain automatism in the content moderation doesn't take place, because there must be a recognition and must be a guarantee for media service providers that in case there is some sort of moderation activity, they will know in advance, and their complaints will be handled in priority, and also that there will be a regular dialogue with platforms in case of something doesn't go well, but also to make sure that the rules that we have in place work well. So this digital aspect was very important for when designing this proposal. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight, that we also recognized that in some cases the problems to editorial independence come from inside. Media pluralism mapping Media Freedom Portal reported last year over 110 cases related to issues of interference or related to relationship between media owners and editorial teams. That's why the only one obligation that we have in the Media Freedom Act for media services aims to promote the culture of editorial independence inside of the media companies. So we ask media companies to do more to increase their accountability through making sure that information on ownership structure is accessible to their audiences. But we also have this novel obligation when we ask media companies to take measures that they deem the most adequate. So we really give a broad margin of maneuver, but we ask to take actions to make sure that the editorial independence is protected through entire process of news production within the media company. And that's why also the proposal was accompanied with a recommendation, which was a very practical tool when we wanted to create some sort of list of best practices that already exist, that media companies take to empower journalists within editorial teams, to make their position stronger within the corporate structure of media companies, for instance, through various consultation exercises, but also to launch a discussion on the business model of media companies that could be the most favorable for safeguarding editorial independence. So I think that would be all for your brief visit in Brussels. From my side, I just wanted to highlight that really, I just mentioned a couple of articles, but if you read the proposal, heart to heart, I think in every article there is the protection of editorial independence was in back of our head when we were drafting it.
Thank you, Mate. I can comfort you, we're going to stay in Brussels. We come back. It's not going to be a brief visit because there's a lot more in there, as you said. I'm beginning to understand a little bit the difference between the puzzle piece and the whole puzzle, because if one actually looks at the whole EMFA, there is a lot more in there than we can cover here in this panel. But you've already highlighted especially those articles that indeed focus very much around editorial independence or content that has been done with a high level of editorial responsibility. And that's what we would expect from public service media. So Richard, if we look at that through that lens, it's not surprising that we see public service media in a proposal like that. But at the same time, if it's a piece of legislation that comes from Europe, it might be surprising. So what's your perspective on the EMFA?
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of European public broadcasters. We heard a lot about power. We heard a lot about digital power earlier. Yes. It's there, it's real. I'll give you two facts on top of all the information we've heard from our perspective, and that is that, for example, the top 10 big tech revenues are combined over 40 times more than our members, our 64 public service broadcaster members in Europe. Another fact, US companies control over 80% of subscription VOD in Europe. What we face should not be underestimated, I think, and this is what I sometimes call total competition. It is a superhuman power from top to bottom, from control of the networks and the gatekeepers to competing in content, to buying the writers, to buying the production houses. So that's what we face. The platforms control our future to some extent. We need regulation. We know about the weaknesses of competition law. We know that it takes too long, that it's too ex post, it's too expensive. So we need regulation. We've seen DSA, we've seen DMA, and we've heard about it. This was a solid toe in the water. Great, thank you from the EU, really great initiatives, but we need more. And I think the MFA for us is an opportunity. It's great to underpin, to promote independent media, and we fully support that. It's also an opportunity to rebalance. And I think for us, the draft is good, it's solid, but we need more on a couple of two key areas, which I'll mention if I may. One is prominence. So it mentions that there should be guidance from the member states, from the EU on prominence. We need prominence to be mandatory. We need the member states to bring in prominence rules to make sure general interest content is available. Because what's the point, and to be provocative here, what's the point in underpinning independent media, independent information, if it can't be found, if it's lost in the sea, on the online sea? So we need that to be mandated for member states in the MFA. Second important point, as has been mentioned, is that we need regulated and edited content. And don't forget that the commercial sector and also the public service media is heavily regulated at the national level. We need that content to be unmolested and not taken down unilaterally for commercial reasons, for any old reason we find actually quite often, by the platforms. So therefore, it's Article 17 is the draft in the MFA. This happens, this is a clear and present danger for our members. Happens quite a lot. I have many examples, but I won't go into them now for reasons of time. We have already the DSA, which has been mentioned. That's just transparency, but transparency is no remedy for us, because if Mark beats me with a stick for taking too long on this panel, if he tells me about it, that's not a remedy. You know? What the MFA does, and the draft MFA does, is bring in the idea that we will be notified in advance before he beats me with a stick. Again, not that helpful to us. We need something more. We're regulated, we're quality content. We need to be able to enter into dialogue and to give our reasons before we're taken down. We don't want the platforms to act first and then ask questions later. So that's our first ask. In terms of the complaints, and that has been mentioned, MFA's a much better step forward in terms of dealing with complaints without undue delay. We need something more concrete, more quick. We need 24 hours. We need to, if it is not justified to take down our content, it needs to be back up there in 24 hours. This is what we'd ask for. We have other goals and dreams for the MFA, particularly for brand attribution. We think citizens of Europe should know who's talking to them, so the brand attribution is very important. Audience measurement, real, clear access to audience measurement is absolutely key for the future of our businesses. I think that's more or less it for me. I think for us, MFA, great, really ambitious. We welcome it. We really, obviously, we ourselves promote independent media. We are worried that if it doesn't ensure that media PSM content is available in an unmolested way and can be found, that it may fail in its goals, to be blunt. So that's our position. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was very clear that it is a welcome initiative, but still to be improved from your perspective. I was wondering whether I would ever want to, as a moderator, become violent, and I'm glad you stayed so well in time that it's not necessary. Caspar, when we hear independence, and then in the same sentence, regulation to ensure independence, does that go hand in hand or not from the perspective of a media ombudsman?
Well, I think it's a perfect fit, actually. I believe that, first, let me take you through a 30-second history lesson about the Swedish system of self-regulation. The system has been around for over 100 years, but the media ombudsman was created in the 60s when the politician wanted to legislate and prevent the freedom of the press, because the media at that time did quite aggressive and offensive publications. The tabloids were very offensive. And the politicians said that we are going to stop you, we're going to regulate and legislate. And then the media said, no, we don't want, we want our freedom. And the politicians said, you can't handle your freedom. And then the media said, well, we create our own system to regulate this. So we take care of bad things we do. We take care of when we hurt people by our publishing business. And so that was the beginning of the system and what the system we have today. So actually, I believe it's very important to, when you have strong and protective laws for protecting the freedom of the press, to also have a self-regulated system together with that. Or not together, because it's very important that the self-regulated system works apart from the state and the government and the authorities. But when you get such a great freedom, like in Sweden, the media are free to publish almost whatever they want. When you have such a great freedom, you also need to take responsibility, of course. And that is, I believe, what the Swedish media are doing. And that gives them a very high trust, as Tobias was saying, that the trust in the Swedish media are still very high. And that is, I believe, because they are they are freely joined a system where they promise to take responsibility and to do good things. And that also keeps the politicians away from legislating, because this system works. And I have seen a revival of this system in the last years, because I believe with the digitalization and the Twitter and the Breitbart and the fake news and everything, it's more important than ever for the traditional media to show how they differs from all the shit, that's out there on the internet. So it's important to show we are taking responsibility, we are something else. Why should you have a subscription on a Swedish newspaper, local or national? That's because that newspaper takes responsibility. They seek the truth. They have methods for seeking the truth. And they have certain journalistic methods to verify information and so on. And if you can show that, you show the difference from Facebook and Twitter and Breitbart when it comes to the traditional and trustworthy media. So that's why I think it's a perfect fit to have those two parallel systems working together.
May I then follow up with one brief question on
Yep.
that? And would you see that better placed in Sweden or in Denmark or wherever else? Or can the regulatory approach from the European Union help safeguard that these systems can stay in place?
No, I think that those systems, the system of self-regulation must have a big distance from the government, from the authorities. That's very, very important to not... in Sweden, we try to keep the state from intervening at all in the system. So that's very important.
Okay, so possibly one of the rights that Maciej mentioned, interference against editorial work, could be a way of stopping that. The reason why I said that PEEP is because I was just wondering whether that would already be censored for foul language if your intervention now is streamed later online on one of the platforms, because we used a word that we're not supposed to use. But that's one of the things we can maybe discuss when it comes to the power of tech giants. I would like to move over now to you, Petra. Again, a traditional, and I hope you see it positive, it's not a negative expression, traditional media company, but not traditional in the sense of looking backwards, but looking forward. So what's your take on how regulation can help or not?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for being able to talk about these important issues today. Schibsted is a Nordic media company. We have the biggest newspapers in Norway and Sweden, and we have always been very active on issues regarding freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and have taken an active stance on how we think the media should or should not be regulated in order to really protect these principles that are enshrined in national constitutions and also EU treaties. For us, and also before I go into the MFA, I want to sort of talk a little bit about how we see this landscape that we are in today. And of course, for us, a successful media landscape is built on trust in established media, traditional media, but also, of course, dependent on a democratic system. And I think there is a great quote by Maria Ressa that says that without facts, you can't have truth, without truth, you can't have trust, and without these, you can't really have a democratic system. Unfortunately, as we have heard today, we have a lot of countries in the world, but also in Europe, that have this trust in both the traditional media, but also in the democratic crumbling. But in fact, also in our own markets here in the Nordics, we have big groups of society that do not trust our media. They don't read our media because they think we are biased towards certain interests, for example. And we at Schibsted, we have started to look into this. We have an extensive research project called Inclusion Lab, or InLab, where we are looking into why is this, what are the reasons for this, and we hope that this will give us important revelations for the future. So how do we restore the trust then and ensure better conditions for our media? First of all, we think that, of course, not everything should be solved by policies and government regulations. We think that we can stay relevant and offer high-quality products by having the best talent, by using new technologies, but also by analyzing data so we understand our users. For us, it's important to be as attractive as possible so that readers come to us rather than going to social networks, for example, for their news consumption. But of course, national governments can help, and we think that especially national media policy is about setting subsidies in ensuring financing for media, ensure also funding and sufficient funding for public service and a clear framework for public service, but also to ensure that the legal system protects the journalists. And then we have the National Press Ethical Codes that Kasper talked about, where we can have more detailed rules about, for example, the relationship between the owners and the editors and the tasks of the editors-in-chief. In Norway, in fact, we have a law, the Media Liability Act, that has codified some of these principles, which is one of its kind in Europe. But of course, we also need the EU, because as we are now digital actors, and we are on the digital market, and digital market is not national, so we need to have rules, and we have rules on data in the GDPR. We have rules that should give us compensation from platforms to publishers in the publisher's right. And we have the DMA, which is, of course, very important to also limit the way and ensure that we can negotiate with gatekeepers. For us, for example, digital subscriptions are extremely important, and we think that the DMA can help to boost that. But what we do lack is a rule that protects us from, and especially our content, on online platforms that Richard was talking about. Because what we see every day in our newsrooms is editors-in-chief and editors taking the rules of social networks into account. So, for example, an article that shows a picture with blood or nudity, we cannot publish or we cannot spread it on social networks. So we actually have to take these rules into account every day. And that is something we think should be remedied. So we hope that this can be now solved in the upcoming discussions. So for us, it's clear what should be done on national level and on EU level. But we now, of course, see this increased distrust in media being disguised as propaganda, or states interfering in media content or media companies. And we therefore do support this attempt from the Commission to remedy this harmful development in the European Media Freedom Act. We are, of course, of the opinion that the EU must be very careful when it's regulating the press, and it should not have any scrutiny over national rules or press content. But the MFA includes a lot of important principles that we think should be upheld in Europe. And these are the principles in particular about editorial independence from owners, from platforms, and from the states. However, we are of the opinion that the MFA also needs to be improved in the negotiations. For example, the article on the relationship between the owners and the editors must be clarified in order to actually understand what is the role of which. We also need to have more strong rules when it comes to this Article 17 on the relationship between media and the very large online platforms, because it's not only about suspending our content, it's also about not restricting our content. We think that the board, which is being proposed, should in particular then focus on cross-border cases, not on national cases. And the role of big tech must be taken into account when there are assessments of media concentration cases. So we will be, of course, very active working on these issues and hope to do it together with many of you here in the room, because it's important that we get this right, and it's important that we don't take it too far in order to regulate the national subsidiarity of the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. I think what has become clear from several of the interventions is that we're kind of in a dilemma. On the one hand, regulation is, at least in the old perception, regarded as something that puts on additional burden. And now we're in a situation where regulation is called for to help out on a situation that has built up because of the economic realities. So maybe I would turn to you, Tobias, for one additional question. You yourself said that the new regulatory framework has to, for example, ensure that data access is possible, because one of the big challenges, one needs to deal with data. Petra has just confirmed that. So do you think, from your perspective, it was not your task to look in depth into the European Media Freedom Act proposal, but do you think a regulatory approach can help to open up this avenue to more data sovereignty, let's call it like that, of the publishers or of the media companies? Does the DSA, DMA already do enough in that direction so that it can further build on this subscriber success as you have described for the Nordic markets?
Well, as you said, this is not my field of expertise, but of course you can regulate to make it more easy to access to this data, and of course that might be helpful, because one of the reasons that the platforms are being so successful is that we like them, we use them, so they get access to this data. When they access to this data, they can even further strengthen their positions. So if it's possible to distribute and make the data more accessible to the market, it will probably be better for both for journalism and for democracy.
So that's a multifunctionality that the law basically has to fulfill if we do that. I go back one moment to you, Petra. What do we do with the dilemma that Tobias indicated about the exclusivity of the content? So the valued content that you have, you put behind a paywall because maybe that is what makes the difference. As you said, we have to know what is the difference between the other content out there and yours. Do you see a way out there for public service media? May be different, but for commercially operating companies, this balancing between we do something exclusive for our subscribers, but at the same time we take up our role of contributing to information?
Well, I think that one needs to do both. I mean, of course, as we have heard today as well and from Tobias, the digital subscriptions are really important because, of course, the advertising market is very volatile. And in fact, I mean, we do both in our newspapers. So we have newspapers that have most content free, and then we have some content behind paywalls, a kind of a plus subscription. And we have broadsheets that would be mainly subscription-based, but for example, now with the war in Ukraine and other sort of big news sort of situations, we would put that for free. So for us, it's of course really important important that we can also get broad audiences, but it depends a little bit on which newspaper we are talking about, of course, and we have regional newspapers as well, which has a different sort of angle. But I think it's important that we can all compete on the market on fair basis, and that is why we also need to get the data in order to understand how people want to consume their content and in which way.
The reason why I ask that question is I think it is important to understand that the EMFA quotes media as being a public good, but a public good doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically for free or it is public service media which is pre-financed. It's still a market at the same time, and that's the balance that sometimes is difficult. May I turn to you, Carl? Hearing what has been said, Richard says one way of maybe countering this development that you described is to putting reliable content that is made by public service media prominent. Otherwise, it may not even make sense to invest into this content being created. Do you think that is a way of breaking that power that you described before, that the growth groups within the tech companies are not so much interested in what drives the growth as long as the growth is driven, and therefore these negative effects that you described come up? Or is that not yet enough?
Well, I mean, we need to start establishing a series of principles and rules around like how to create content which isn't about optimizing attention on platforms. Now, of course, yeah, kind of making some quite crude, probably kind of rule-based kind of intervention which elevates trusted publishers over others is one step. And by the way, the tech giants already do this with Wikipedia. Oh, by the way, for the disinformation researchers in the room, Wikipedia is a massively overlooked source for disinformation. We've massively over-focused on Twitter and Facebook when it comes to actually worrying about where these onlines are. That's another sidebar. So it already, to an extent, happens. The thing that, if you look, the thing I'm most excited by at the moment, if you look under all the froth and bluster and chaos that's rippling across Twitter, is there's been a very quiet experiment in platform moderation, which has kind of survived all the turmoil, which they're now calling community notes. It used to be called Birdwatch. And the idea of it, in a nutshell, is to basically, when you've got a divisive or controversial or just outright wrong tweet, you allow the community to all write lots of kind of contextualizing notes on that tweet. And which one gets actually appended is done by a completely different algorithm. And it's called bridge-based ranking. Rather than just surfacing the stuff that you click on, bridge-based ranking looks at what everyone thinks is useful, agrees with, draws out an opinion space, so you've got different partisan groups, and then looks at what is useful across those opinion spaces. So it's algorithmic, it's scalable, but what it does is it actually surfaces content which is consensual, not content which is divisive. The most interesting digital democratic initiatives in the world are predicated on the same basic idea. So there are ideas. You know, I mean, and that creeping into Twitter for the first time is the first time that we've seen any tech giant, and to my knowledge anyway, carefully pivot for one moment away from simply optimizing attention. And magic happens when you start tweaking platform engineering. You know, you suddenly start unearthing all these things that we have in common with each other, which we didn't know about.
Whereas what you said before probably is this is a pre-Elon Musk takeover development, and it's not absolutely clear how that will continue.
He loves it.
Okay.
He loves it because it's scalable and because it kind of outsources content moderation. So it actually, in a weird way, it means that it kind of it does something which I think a lot of the platforms have been trying to do for a while, which is finding ways actually for them to take less responsibility over those kinds of decisions. I don't think the tech giants meant to get this kind of power, by the way. They kind of almost accidentally swallowed media. I don't think it's a power they particularly relish or particularly would like to have. I think it's a power they would absolutely love to find a way of getting rid of if they could.
I think we can all immediately agree when it comes to content moderation, because that is not an easy task to do. And Caspar, there I was wondering, it is a completely different context than an established, let's say, market in a national media context like in Sweden. We heard about the global dimension, and that's one of the issues also before in the session, that the rollout of the content is global, and therefore already it's different. But can content moderation, no matter how it is being done, can dealing with content which already has gone through an internal check on such platforms learn lessons from media/press self-regulation like in your context? Is that something which basically has been happening already in the past, which maybe can be transferred into that space? Or are they so different because they have a different way of being rolled out, the content, because it's user-generated content, because it's global, that you cannot really give any lessons for the tech community to learn?
I think it would be hard to learn lessons from the traditional media or from the trustworthy media, and because that is editor-driven, it's driven by journalism, and there are certain methods used. And when you are having these content that every single person can create, is something completely different. So I would say, yeah, it's two different things. And in the self-regulated system of Sweden, of course, we don't regulate Twitter and Facebook and so on. Thank God we don't. But I think the lessons to be learned isn't to take the rules that we have and export them to Facebook. I don't think that would work. Sorry.
So would you then regard that as rather being something that has to be subject to hard regulation because it cannot be left to the companies themselves, or is it still something that can be done independent of regulation?
You mean what the tech giants are doing? I don't know. I don't think that hard regulation is the way forward for them. No, okay. I don't.
Okay. So I will pass that on to you back, Richard, because that I think that is one of another one of the dilemmas in which we are in. On the one hand, we heard already several times that regulation is not allowed to conflict with the free speech approach, but you yourself say, well, but this is the only way that we can actually ensure a meaningful, let's call it meaningful free speech conversation online, if I understood you correctly. So in a way, regulation has to ensure what normally maybe would happen on the marketplace of ideas automatically if the marketplace would be different. Is that the way you would see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple examples of where regulation is needed ex ante, and of course it is delicate. Ex ante regulation is always delicate, but think about essential facilities doctrines and all the case law there and the competition law. There are certain infrastructure that everyone must have fair access to. This is the situation in terms of competition. In terms of free speech, well, the logic of the MFA is surely that if you are underpinning media independence, if you are ensuring editorial responsibility and independence of European media, it must be found. And it must then be left alone, we've had multiple problems. There was one in Denmark of a children's app just being randomly taken down by Google, and I think it was quite public, and there was quite an intense debate about it. Eventually, it just popped back up again with no explanation. This can't happen. This can't happen.
And that actually similarly relates to the example with the blood, which is not exactly something very problematic, you would imagine, and already that is enough. So there's a kind of an advance power even before the content goes out. It's not only the moderation afterwards that's been mentioned. While I will ask Maciej the next question, you can gear up if you would like to also for a question from the audience. It is indeed, as the previous moderators have said, quite difficult because you're kind of in a fog like yesterday night because of the light. But if you clearly raise your hand, then we will pass on the question. We've got number one. Before we do that, Maciej, after you've heard this first round of reactions, to what extent can the EMFA define concepts like editorial independence? What does independence of the individual journalist vis-à-vis the publisher mean? Is law, or very specifically a regulation of the European Union, the EMFA, a place where this can be conclusively decided on, or can it only be a framework? That's something I think that a lot of the community is wondering about. How detailed does the EMFA have to be without being too detailed in a way?
Yes, definitely. I think it was one of the challenges of drafting this piece of legislation, to understand the level of detail when, for instance, when we talk about this relationship about the owner and the editors. And I think, again, the idea was to really promote the culture of editorial independence with recognition that also media is also a business. Our line is that that's not like any other business, but we also recognize this economic aspect. That's why in the recitals we propose to have this distinction that, of course, as a business owner, you have a right to set the general editorial line, but the process of creating information, so the individual piece of information, the ultimate product that goes to the audience, should be safeguarded as a public good, as you mentioned, and should be produced within some sort of channel of independence. So that's why we propose to distinguish a little bit these two concepts. I hope we are finding some sort of middle ground in the level of detail. I wanted to also reflect on one aspect that I think was quite visible in this discussion, is about transparency and about access of data. We touched a little bit the issue of audience measurement, which indeed is a key tool for media companies when they how they can plan and how they can make sure that the division of economic resources is fair, which not necessarily is always the case. We noticed that, for instance, in the media sector, there are certain self-regulatory standards that are widely accepted and that deliver a desirable level of transparency when industry itself agreed how we measure the audience, which is not necessarily the case of the new and the powerful players in the media ecosystem that developed sometimes very proprietary audience measurement systems. And with Media Freedom Act, we very much wanted to precisely tackle this lack of information, building up, it's another puzzle, building up on Digital Markets Act. So media services would not only have information on how their content performs in the ecosystem of very large online platforms, but that they would also have information how this performance is measured. So they would have information on methodology. So this would enable to have a little bit fuller picture and comprehensive set of information. So this imbalance when it comes to information and how it affects the media sector was something that we also try to address through this proposal.
Petra, answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually reply or comment on what you were talking about, this sort of framework or rules thing. I think that it's very important in such a regulation that we actually keep it to framework, especially when it comes to the principles in the beginning, where sort of Articles 4 and 6, because if we go into regulating that with sort of sanctions or scrutiny on EU level, then we are really going too far, I would say. So it's important to make sure that these days principles guide member states that may not have those kind of principles or where they're not upheld. I think that is really important from our point of view.
Just a second, we first get into the question, and somewhere there it was, yes.
Hi, I'm Inger Skalse representing TV4 Media, and I have a comment. If we want to create good soil for media publishing, we need to look at, we can't look at regulation alone. We have to see how regulation interacts with social culture. And I wanted to mention this because the Media Pluralism Monitor was mentioned, and that the results of that makes it into the EMFA impact assessment. And when I looked at it, it says that Sweden has a high risk of owner influencing the editorial content, and that was a big surprise, especially since we got very low risk when it comes to media freedom, freedom of speech and autonomy, what's it called? Editorial autonomy. So it just looks very wrong. So we're at high risk along with countries like Turkey. And of course, then something is wrong with how that is sort of looked at. And so I just want to raise this thing that you really have to look at social culture, how that interacts with the regulation, because there really isn't anything missing in the Swedish regulation when it comes to the owners, I would say. I mean, it works perfectly. So I just want to highlight that. We can't just, because what happens if you set up a research project like that is that you risk creating very political results to push for one way of doing things rather than others. So that's
I will
my
turn the
comment.
comment into a question and pass it directly back to you, and then you can combine it, meaning that it's not the Media Pluralism Monitor alone, I assume, that led the Commission to propose the EMFA. It's one indicator beyond many, or what is the role of the Media Pluralism Monitor?
I think the Media Pluralism Monitor for us in the past couple of years become really one of the main sources of independent research on the functioning of the internal media market. And I take the criticism because as any academic tool, Media Pluralism Monitor is based on certain methodology. In this case, it's a risk-based assessment. And it's true that in certain cases, for instance, in case of country like Sweden, it might, in certain indicator, might say that there is a high risk, for instance, due to a minimalistic legal approach. And this is something, this is not a novelty for us. This is something that we kept very much in mind. That's why I think this is a very good question, because I could highlight how we actually provide already a solution in Media Freedom Act. So I can refer you to Article 25, that aims to establish a new monitoring exercise, building on this great expertise of Media Pluralism Monitor, because I think this is something that I wanted to very much highlight. You mentioned the risk of that it could be a politically influenced exercise, and this is something that I wanted to highlight, that absolutely it's the idea was always to have something very independent and monitoring that is carried out by academic institution of high prestige. But we take the criticism, and through the Media Freedom Act, we propose to take one extra step and upgrade this assessment to make sure that precisely such cases are no longer present, that we have assessment that really looks on the resilience, on the functioning of the internal market, to have a little bit of this business spin. So hopefully, I think, thanks to Media Freedom Act, such a question will not take place in the future.
I was actually going to open up the possibility for another question, but I think that already closes it. So we will leave it at there, especially since I've got this interesting situation. On one of our monitors, the time froze, so it's only 5:20. Don't get nervous. But the reality is the other monitor is still giving us the real information. It's not the fake news on that side. It's 17:59, so we have to actually come to a close. After I've closed my session, there will be a few more words by the organizers that are kindly hosting this conference, so don't immediately get up. Maybe one thing that we can take away from this session for now is growth, not only for the growth purpose, but growth still also with a purpose that goes beyond the participation in the democratic discourse is something that has clearly come to the forefront, both as an intention of the regulator, or of the legislator, but also of the media that are concerned by it. So I'm curious to see tomorrow on day 2 how the regulator, the regulatory authorities deal with this, and what media literacy can take for a place. I would like you all to thank my panelists. It was a great and informative discussion. Our keynote speakers, I think we could go on for quite a while, so maybe for those of you that like talking about laws, the dinner will give us another opportunity. Well done.